This is iCastNews.com, live and direct from United Nations headquarters in New York City. And this is Bubbling Under and Bubbling Over. Bubbling Under and Bubbling Over this week, well, it's the simplest thing. Civilization versus barbarity, life versus death, us versus them, blind obedience, critical thinking versus machine-like behavior. First, in South Sudan. A report is just in from Ivan Semyonovich, the Special Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights, who has just visited South Sudan and says horrors, simply horrors. Wherever he's gone, he has seen the remnants of the grossest kind of barbarity, brutality, and human conflict. He's seen bodies in the streets. His description is that a political conflict between the Nuer and the Dinka peoples has turned into the most brutal kind of ethnic, tribal, basic warfare between two different groups of people. This coincides with the report that's just out from Human Rights Watch, which says that there have been ethnic clashes with people being destroyed, eliminated, shot, murdered, raped, pillaged, hacked up, simply for being the member of the wrong ethnic group. They've called for a ban on travel of anyone involved in these groups for an investigation. But the heart of the matter is that with the UNMISS, the United Nations mission down there in Sudan, struggling just to protect people, to keep people alive, to get up to a larger ceiling of troops that has recently been authorized, just keeping the peace and keeping people safe in the camps that they have fled to that are run by the United Nations is a large mission. One indication of how basic, brutal, and just uncivilized life has become in the youngest nation in the world is that Doctors Without Borders, one of the toughest, most resilient organizations on the planet, has pulled its people out of South Sudan. Syria. With a few days to go before talks are supposed to begin in Switzerland about whether there can be a transition in Syria, there's a great deal of activity in Istanbul, where the Syrian National Council is meeting to try and decide these moderates or want to see if they really want to go and participate in the Syrian process. Out of Moscow, there is activity where the Syrian foreign minister is now offering some kind of prisoner exchange. There are words coming out of Washington where Secretary of State Kerry is talking about how the United States retains a commitment to a transition away from Bashar al-Assad. There's a lot of noise. What the principles involved in pushing for the Syrian transition peace process are really aiming at is not any great transition right away. Nuts and bolts, localized agreements, the kind of immediate faith-building, confidence-building measures that might get one little city or town to have a ceasefire to evacuate wounded people, or another to have a prisoner exchange. Larger issues of government change are still being held up, and as the Shiite-Sunni war that's now spreading into Iraq ramps up, it's hard to expect anything more than the most basic kind of move. There's been a great deal of pressure by the Russians, by the Americans, to just get the most basic process underway. People will still be holding their breaths to see what goes on. This, while the Human Rights Council out of Geneva, headed by Nave Pillay this week, High Commissioner for Human Rights Nave Pillay warned armed opposition groups in Syria that execution and unlawful killings are a violation of international human rights and humanitarian law and may amount to war crimes. There are, in fact, war crimes aplenty going on in the civil war-racked, uncivilized, warfare, torn country that remains Syria. whether some of their warriors will want to dismember Syria, reunite some tribal members, some Shiites with Shiites, Sunnis with Sunnis in Iraq, is the nightmare that both the United States and Russia wants to avoid. Today marks 3 years since the Tunisian Revolution. 3 years since the actions triggered a revolution triggered by the most humble of men, Mohamed Bouazizi, a 26-year-old fruit peddler who had been supporting his family since he was 10 years old, wanted to go out and sell some fruit. A member of the Tunisian officialdom fined him about $7 worth of local currency, took away his fruit. He started protesting, set himself on fire. Weeks later, in response to this, first his friends and then other people in Tunisia started a massive uprising that brought down the government of Tunisia that had been in power for more than 23 years. Revolutions begin with humble actions based on the most fundamental of things. Food, usually. We saw that in France, in the French Revolution. The people who launched the February 1917 revolution in St. Petersburg, Russia, wanted a fair distribution of bread during the First World War. Americans, or people who would become Americans, dumped tea in the British harbor as a protest for taxes. Simple things spread. In this case, not only was the protest fanned by many young people like Mohamed Bouazizi who were unemployable, university-educated people who were unemployed, underemployed, but it was spread by popular culture, by the songs of a rapper, El General, that were listened to. 3 years. In Tunisia, while they haven't solved the problems of unemployment among educated people, they're a lot more on their way than Egypt. Egypt, by comparison, is now voting on a new constitution. The new constitution is getting a 95% approval rating. The military is back in charge of Egypt. And the military is not solving problems, they're keeping order. And one of the ways they're keeping order is by arresting, harassing, and stopping journalists. Within recent days, the Egyptian military authorities have detained and then released some Associated Press journalists, accusing them of working for the Marriott Cell. What's the Marriott Cell? That's the name the Egyptian government has given to people who work for Al Jazeera, 3 of whose leading journalists are now in jail for doing that simple thing, telling the truth, or in the words of the Egyptian military, spreading lies, falsifications, undermining the economy of Egypt by spreading things that don't agree with the Egyptian government. The 3 journalists are prize winners. Al Jazeera is the only Arab language broadcaster that, by satellite technology, is putting a message that does not conform with what the Egyptian military wants into that country. Freedom of speech is something precious, necessary, and an element informing a public about whether they should vote or shouldn't vote for a new constitution, about what's going on in their country. The contrast, 3 years out, between the still hopefulness of Tunisia and the hatefulness of what's going on in Egypt is a marked difference. Beijing, China. Don't go outside. Don't breathe the air. Well, you have to breathe the air. Everyone has to breathe. A cloud of smog has descended on China, a cloud so dangerous to people's health that they might as well be smoking 3 packs of Russian cigarettes a day. The highways between Shanghai and Beijing have been closed because cars are generating part of the pollution, as are power plants and old factories run by the Chinese military burning coal that pollutes. This is indicative of a larger problem. The United Nations has just come to the conclusion that in the last year, 2013, investment in clean air, green technology has gone down 12%, where the world needs, according to the International Energy Agency, about $1 trillion a year investment in clean production of energy technology. Last year there was $254 billion. This is the second year in a row that investment in clean energy technology has gone down. There are some exceptions. Europe's gone down by 40%. Japan has gone up by 55% last year. Part of that is in reaction to the horror show, the barbarity, the radiation glowing that came out of the Fukushima disaster, and the Japanese, who are also sensitive to atomic issues, decision to close all their atomic reactors. According to the report of the International Energy Agency, unless something is done to invest in new technology that produces green, clean energy, the world is going to have to find a way to retrofit the atmosphere, to suck carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide out of the atmosphere in 10 years or 20 years and put it in caves under the surface of the earth. Not good news that the investment in clean energy has declined as the Great Recession is wrapping up its march across the earth. The Vatican this week came under incredible accusation in Geneva. The Vatican's representative, Bishop Sitzluni, was questioned about what the Vatican has been doing to stop the plague of molestation of young boys around the world. He is accused, and the Vatican, which is a member of the UN, is being charged with violating the Convention on the Rights of the Child. The Convention of Rights of the Child, adopted in 1979, to which all nations on the globe have signed on, except for South Sudan, Somalia, and the United States, charges countries, governments, with protecting children, keeping them from sexual and physical abuse. The bishop, under cross-questioning and relentless examination, said, "The Holy See gets it. Let's not say too late or not, but there are certain things that need to be done differently." Under the new Pope, the Vatican certainly gets it. Just an hour ago, the Vatican leaked a report which said under the previous Pope, Benedict XVI, 400 priests were defrocked. That's considerably more than in the previous reporting period, when only 117. The Vatican leaking to the Associated Press the specifics of 400 priests being defrocked means that there is at least a consciousness that on a public relations level, they must do something about pedophile priests. The Convention on the Rights of Children will be giving a report in early February, but they have no powers to enforce it, no powers to levy fines, no powers to prosecute. This is a case of moral suasion. Will Pope Francis come clean to the world community, to the UN, to the world Catholic community? Coming clean also means dealing with the consequences of the past. In Poland, people who were heirs to the individuals who owned land, property, upon which was built the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camps, are now asking for some 3 million euros to compensate them for land that was taken from them to build these horror chambers, the concentration camps, the symbols of the worst of totalitarian Nazi German rule during the Second World War. The people who run the museum at the concentration camp, where it famously says Arbeiter macht frei, work will set you free, say, we don't have anything to do with this, we're just a museum. The Polish government says that restitution for acts committed by foreign governments during the Second World War is not their responsibility. And it turns out that there is absolutely no bilateral treaty for compensating people who were victims of the Nazi realm in Poland or most anywhere else. And finally, on the same lines of the Second World War, Hiro Onoda, 91 years old, died this week. Hiro Onoda was the last Japanese officer to surrender 29 years after the end of the Second World War. Hiro Onoda was an intelligence officer. He was on a small island in the Philippines, and he did not believe the Second World War was over. And for 29 years, he hid in the jungle, keeping his lonely vigil up because the emperor had not told him to surrender. He only gave up his post when, in the middle of the 1970s, they brought his commanding officer, who used a megaphone to tell him that the war was over and that he was ordered to surrender. For some, Hiro Onoda is seen as the loyal soldier, the man who wouldn't give up, the man who believed his emperor. But to others, he resembles that kind of person who made the Japanese conquest of places like China and the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and made the mental set of the Nazi realm that operated at the concentration camp Auschwitz-Birkenau possible. People who were only following orders, who were loyal to a concept, to a supreme being, a god on earth, a king or an emperor, who had no conscience of their own. He should not only be mourned, he should stand as an example of the unthinking, obedient person who makes the rule of barbarity possible in hellish times. For ICAStNews.com, live and direct from United Nations headquarters in New York City, I'm Jonathan Sanders.